Morning. I'm just doing this wee early morning. Well, it's later morning now, but I was up early this morning. A nice person from the vineyard sent me, Einaham sent me this last night, in my inbox, and I don't know what happened when I listened to it, and I was profoundly sort of moved. I just want to thank Carol, and the original Anaheim Vineyard. I'm getting emotional because that was my first church, my first love, and for them to have taken for Alan and Midge and the rest of them, John, et al, Gordy, Vinny, for them to have done what they done with that movement was a shame, because I believe that there was so much tenderness and so much goodness in the vineyard. But these things have came up for healing so many years later, and I just want to share my thoughts on part of one of the threads that was brought out in the podcast was Alan's kind of weird belief system, which I'm not surprised about. I was given some context on X earlier. You had ruthless ambition amongst this group of men, and you've got to see it as a gang mentality because it was how much they influenced each other. But in that part of Glasgow, and in Glasgow, there was a culture of, gangs. And so everybody wanted to be the gang leader, the man, the scary guy. Oh, it's just such a stupid ambition and self-sabotaging, but the men insist, on playing out these roles, and then they model it for their sons. When I came to the church, I was 14, 15, and before I actually physically stepped into the building, I was being groomed by these people and terrorised. And Sinead O'Connor brought it up, when she said about how the Catholic priests used to terrorise the Waynes back in Ireland, with stories about, slipping into hell if they hadn't had confession or communion before they died. And the Waynes would have nightmares about being dragged by the feet out of bed at night, into hell, because they hadn't had confession that week. And this sort of psychological terrorism gets really sophisticated when it meets Glasgow gangsterism. We've got an infiltration of our institutions here in the UK. It's kind of documented in the press, and I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but Operation Tiberius exposed how a lot of our institutions have been infiltrated by gangsters, the police included, and that's what Operation Tiberius showed. That there's been a meeting of the mafiosa with our so-called safeguarding and regular institutions within the structures of our nation, if you like. So gangsterism's bled into our institutions, and it's part of it has been sort of spearheaded with men like this here. That's how I see it. Now, nobody needs to listen to me. I'm just a wee woman from Glasgow that had suffered at the hands of these guys years ago. But I do think it's quite ironic how Alan projects out this judgment onto people to use it as a method of control. It's quite sadistic. We used to all fast, and it's really just a spiritual competition to see who's the most spiritual. And people like Gordy and Alan used to fast the most, if you like, and they would almost starve themselves to death. So I don't want to hurt anybody that's suffering with an eating disorder, or because what kind of suffering is going on. It makes me want to actually. It's one of the things that I see with Lena Zavaroni in the music business, a show with Karen Carpenter, and it actually feel my heart hurting when I think about anorexia and what it does to people. But then to turn it outwards onto other people and judge them with that, it's a really judgmental, critical, sadistic eye that measures and, and humiliates. There's a sneering humiliation behind it. And I get this, and that's what was being dished out in the name of the Vineyard in Glasgow in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. That was when 1989, if I'm right, there was a sort of talk between some of the churches and about networking, and then it later evolved into them becoming the first Glasgow Vineyard over in Hardridge, yeah. And I was part of that, transition. I was there during that transition time. So I'm going to play this wee bit of the podcast and let you hear what the good man's saying.
5 or 37, unquote, prophetic words telling him to move to Southern California.
Alan had all these prophetic words telling him to move.
But Alan Scott wasn't applying to just any church. Scott applied to lead the Anaheim Vineyard,
this is the
flagship home to the charismatic Vineyard movement, with over 2,000 churches worldwide.
This means a lot to people. It means
Vineyard
a lot to
leader John Wimber had founded the charismatic church in 1977. He then led the Vineyard movement from Vineyard Christian Fellowship of Anaheim, beginning in 1982 until his death in 1997. Once he was installed as pastor in 2018, Alan Scott began to change the makeup of the church's board of directors. Then in March of 2022, Alan Scott unexpectedly announced he would be leaving the Vineyard movement and changing the name of the church to The Dwelling Place. But Scott didn't just change the name of the church and find a new home for his new church. Alan Scott announced that The Dwelling Place would keep the 5.7-acre property, the sanctuary and building, and over $5 million in cash. He would also keep all the items inside the building, including, for example, a life-size bronze sculpture.
See, I'm sorry, right, but for me, when Street Mission became Vineyard, one of the big things they were, I observed about them was that they were sort of anti-snob. They were reversing, they hated people, materialism, people that were snobby, people that were upper class, that had things, material things. And they were dead against the prosperity gospel and message because of that. And, I think kind of rightly so. Although, there's a lot to be debated about that, but I'm not a Christian anymore, thanks to the, I'm not going to blame, right? But what I'm going to say is that I knew that, my experience has led to, I'll never trust another Christian ever again in my life because of Gordy, Rab, Midge, John and Alan and the leadership there. There's other people I could mention, but they never actually done me any direct, they joined in with this leadership. And they would literally, and they went on and continue to do it in Gordy, put 14-year-old girls out on the street, fatherless. We're supposed to protect the fatherless, the orphans, the widows. But they would put us out in the street, and not just me, it happened again. I survived that. The other 14-year-old did not survive that. I'm quite angry about how certain people are posing as the moral, righteous, and handing over letters to Julie Roy to back up. Yous are moving against Alan because yous were all pals at one time, and now yous have fell out and yous want to bring him down the way yous bring everybody down. And Alan's just using your techniques to on the Vineyard the same way that yous were trying to use on him. But yous are all part of the same gang. And it's nothing to do with God. Let's clarify that and separate all that stuff out. God is a concept. For years, I gave my whole life over to God, and I was genuine. I broke the alabaster jar I gave him everything I had. Everything. Okay, it wasn't much, but it was my everything. And these men would deem you either a witch, you know, it's Madonna and Whore with these people when it comes to women. The misogyny is just systemic. Although they will not show you that. What they're really good at is putting a front on and using movements like the Vineyard to appear like a nice, tender, happy, lovely group of people. And, you know, in the street mission, there was some nice people there. But by, you know, their silence, they enabled some of the most terrible child abuse and grooming, child grooming. And then some of them went on to force other people in their communities to do criminal acts. And they done that, you know, under force of threatening their families and stuff like that. So, you know, I'm scratching the surface here. But, you know, I started
called
off...
Divine Servant. It is of Jesus washing the feet of the Apostle Peter and based on Jesus' message of servant
service.
Leadership and humility.
Yeah.
The bronze had been gifted to John and Carol Wimber by the artist Max Greiner Jr. That sculpture remains in Alan Scott's possession today.
Unbelievable.
In the church's lobby.
That's
the
just
assets
unbelievable. I went off on a tangent there because, you know, one thing I'm really shocked at is Alan doing that. He never ever struck me as somebody that was, you know, he struck me as somebody like, when I was young, I was brought up Catholic and I took the name Claire at my confirmation because she was Claire of the Poor and she wasn't into all that materialism. She came from a rich family and she went and left it and joined the church. This appealed to me, and I know it appealed to people in the street mission, Alan's church, you know, here in Glasgow. Very much so. So this is in sharp contrast to the Alan that I knew back then. I've got to say it. But it just shows you, for me, it's the ruthless ambition that he had, you know. They all had it. And in that competition with each other, they see women in communities as their property to be fought over, or used and abused and discarded, or, you know, pillaged, taken, but not for good reasons, you know. Behind the church, 2 members of that gang were flooding the areas with drugs and violence and guns and serious violence and attacks. Now, the question that I've asked myself, being one of the people that know exactly what was going on in that book, you know, he wrote a book and you would have need to have been there to see through the tissue of lies that he's telling in the timeline. So my question is this: did John and Anne know what Rab and Gordy were up to? Did Alan and Midge and John in the leadership know what Gordy and Rab were doing? Or were Robert and Gordy playing them? Now this is where I come in, because I know the characters. And Robert and Gordy would have been looking at Midge and John Scott and they would have been saying, we're going to replace them here. We're going to become assistant pastors and then we're going to move in on the church. And that's what they were doing. And I think they moved Alan out the way. And so that's just my opinion though. I'm not saying take that as gospel and that's how it was, you know. That was just how I would perceive things, with knowing the characters from back then, but also having to acknowledge as well that people do change and evolve through time. But certain things, character traits like this, they learn how to disguise them under the guise of spirituality. And this is when we're dealing with really sophisticated abusers, you know, people who are clever. They hide their abuse behind a mask and a guise of spirituality, you know. and they make a big business, a show out of that. And I've always found, you know, that the bigger the show, the worse the person is behind that front, you know. So while certain individuals sit on Facebook putting out daily scriptures and shaming women that have had affairs, right? Or, you know, shaming women just for having, you know, sexual desires, as you do, or other men that they deem of lower status. They have this obsession with Jezebel and sexual sin. And, you know, I would sort of put it to them that they're the sort of Jezebels with the sexual sin, as we all now know. Exploiting trafficked women and grooming wee lasses into a church. And it wasn't like we were going into the vineyard. We were going into people who were using that brand. I'm sorry, I don't mean to call it that. It's not a brand for the people that made, but it went, you know, it went global, didn't it? So in that respect, Alan was treating it like it was pure corporate moves what he was doing there. You know, my partner of 20 years was in the oil industry for a while, and I seen the same in APS Dubai and Anadarko, which ended up in the headlines because of Chris Watts. And you see how people can go into that environment and it completely changes them. But
got seized in 2022 are estimated to be valued at over $100 million today.
Unbelievable.
Scott did issue a public statement following his announcement. Quote, "We love the Vineyard movement, and although our association has ended, our affection..."
Yeah, see, abuse isn't love, Alan. Abuse isn't love. Yeah, you loved the Vineyard that much that you took their most precious, most, you know, that's got value that's not to do with money and materialism. Take Harrow in the church and you know, John's memory. And so to do that is so Machiavellian, and I can totally empathise with Carol and the pain that the people in the church are going through, because that's what this wee gang done to my life as well. I might not have had £100 million statue, but let me take and piss on, but they done that to my life. And any relationship I tried to have after that, they tried to sabotage it. Any home that I got, they tried to take it away from me. And they're still trying to do it to this day, because they know that I've never stopped speaking out about them. And some of these guys have got corrupt police and other people in their pocket, people in my health service. And, you know, I don't know how much of their words of knowledge was coming from people's medical records and how much it was coming from God. But they certainly freak people out. And this is another deception when it's false. Do you know what I'm saying? It's really misleading. And it's so damaging, this spiritual abuse. And I'm so glad that the Vineyard have taken this up, because I've been talking about it for years. Spiritual abuse, calling people demon possessed, smearing them. It's just like saying, you know, it's like the old witch trials. You know, you put that mark on somebody and you damage them for the rest of their lives in a place like this. You know, and that's what they do to their enemies. And any women and any ex-wives or any ex-pals or any families of the victims that they've made are all terrified. Same way the North Glasgow Rings victims were terrified. And, you know, obviously I'm the stupid one, so I'm daft enough to come out and say, well, I'm going to stand up here. I just want to thank the rest of the brave souls that are standing up. And Carol, I hope you get as much support as possible, because this guy's he's went down a road with his belief system that's completely warped.
Remains undiminished, unquote. He went on to say that his decision was made, quote, fervently in the fear of the Lord, unquote. Thousands of Christians inside and outside of the Vineyard movement in the Anaheim area, across the United States, and across the world were shocked. Many of them fled with Alan Scott to return the property to its rightful owners, to those who paid for it. This includes Carol Wimber, John Wimber's widow. Here is her direct appeal to Scott just after his announcement, 2022.
Alan, you can't do this. This isn't the way you treat your family. You don't steal from your brother and your sisters. This is family. And the vineyard, as you should know, has been family for a long, long time.
Yep.
Despite multiple attempts, Scott has refused to speak with Carol Wimber.
That is your family, Alan. How could you? What's become of you? How could you be so hard and cold, And I don't want to give you these tears because I know that somewhere along the line, you and John and Midge and Gordy and Rab enjoy this kind of pain that he's inducing people. This is what gives you the feeling of power. So I want you to hear my strength today. Through these tears for Carol, I'm crying for Carol and the pain you've caused her. And I'm just saying I'm glad that yous are all getting exposed. Excuse my throat today. I'm pretty poorly. And my health has been impacted by these men. When people abuse you spiritually and physically, and they terrorise you physically, and you have to move locations because of them, you're living in fear. And you can't have the life that you would have had you not met them. And I'm so sorry, Carol, that you've had to meet these people pretending to be vineyarders, because that's what it is. And I include Gordy and Rab and June Marie and Sharon in that as well. I understand that some of I can't just call them a gang, because when I look back now, it was just a gang, that tried to intimidate people when some of them were up in court, and some of us were witnesses, and we ran away and we went to safety, and they found us. And they sent John Scott up to my new church that I ran away to get protection from them. John Scott was there, stalking by proxy for Rab and Midge and Gordy. What's she doing? Where's she going? What's she saying? Who she's talking to? Make sure they all know she's a bad person. And they whisper behind the scenes to people in their ears, and they pass them letters, and they play everybody off each other. So I'm just trying to say, beware to the vineyarders that are dealing with all these characters, Gordy and that included. And, do due diligence with myself as well. Everybody that you're dealing with, right? There's victims here, and then there's perps, right? And so the people that are hurting and the people that they've left in their wake, you'll hear a lot of them coming forward. I mean, I know at least 3 or 4 and another group of underage teenagers who were being groomed by 2 of these characters at the time. There's a whole thing with caravans and everything. So, I'm probably going to be shot or, set up for everything that I'm saying, because people know who I'm coming against here. And I've been running away for the guy and his pals, who were Midge and Alan and John Scott. I've been running away for these people for years, and they've always kept an eye out to see what I was doing, because some people back at that time were the witness of certain things that happened. And, witnesses either commit suicide or they turn up murdered. So please, everybody, get round the people that are being drawn into this. And while we're focusing on Alan, just remember that there'll be those that play your friend, and they might look like sheep, and they might talk about spirituality really well. In fact, they sat and studied men so that they can practice how to do it, so that they can deceive better. So I would say to these guys, beware, please, beware. Beware who you are dealing with.
Even to this day, Scott has a long history of beliefs that really, for anyone, would be considered, at best, confusing. For example, Scott supports bioenergetics, a view that different physical body types are responsible for different personalities. Certain body types are given a number. In a recording made by a Dwelling Place staff member in August of 2022, You can hear Alan Scott warning his staff about, quote, type 3s, unquote.
Right, I'm just going to stop that there. So he's basically using this horrible sadistic weapon that we call body shaming, right? Or looking at a person's body and judging their character and their intent from that, right? I mean, it all goes back to putting Alan in this position of being God and the dictator of who's good and who's bad and calling the shots. But he's disguising it very, he's using this sort of pseudoscience bullshit, because it reminded me of phrenology, right? And I'm going to end it on this, right? Phrenology was a pseudo, craniology. Craniology is a pseudoscience, involves the measurement of bumps in the skull to predict mental traits, right? So it's based on the concept that the brain is the organ of the mind, right? Now these are like debunked pseudoscientific theories, but me being me, I just had to have a good laugh, and I just had to. So, Alan Scott's cult believes that body type predicts criminality. Did you see the study that said the public don't trust bald men in politics? And how does his stolen church deal with the follically challenged then? Did they see a shiny napper as a sure sign of a crime? So, that's all I'm going to say about that. It's ridiculous. Carol, I hope you get justice, my darling. And, let's run these crazy bald heads out of town, eh?